They said the cabin was worth less than a tank of gas, but some places are not measured by what they can sell for. They are measured by what they have kept safe when the rest of the world stopped looking. Owen Callahan first heard about the cabin on a white morning behind St. Bartholomew's Church in northern Maine, where the parking lot had frozen into a sheet of dull silver and his old pickup sat between two snowbanks like something the winter had forgotten to carry away. He was 40 years old, a white man with a weathered face, quiet gray-blue eyes, short dark brown hair touched with slight silver at the temples, and light stubble along a square jaw that had learned to hold more silence than complaint. His worn olive army field jacket hung loose over a faded denim shirt, the cuffs frayed, the elbows softened by years of use, and his broad shoulders still carried the shape of a soldier even though the life around him had narrowed to a truck cab, a blanket, a toolbox, and the loyal breathing of the German shepherd asleep beside him. Bruno was 6 years old, silver gray and cream in the coat, sharp amber in the eyes, tall in the ears, steady in the heart, wearing a simple black working dog harness that had seen snow, dust, and too many lonely roads. He woke before Owen did, lifting his head from the passenger seat and staring through the frosted windshield toward the church steps. Owen followed his gaze and saw a man in a charcoal overcoat crossing the lot carefully, one hand holding a leather folder against the wind. The man did not look like someone bringing trouble, but trouble had worn polite shoes before, so Owen lowered the window only halfway. The stranger introduced himself as Martin Hale, attorney for the estate of Margaret Ellison. At the sound of her name, Owen's hand tightened around the edge of the window. He remembered Margaret from a night 3 months earlier, when snow had fallen so thick on Route 11 that headlights looked like candles behind lace. Her Buick had slid into a shallow ditch near the old bus station outside Millhaven, and cars had passed slowly, cautious and warm inside, until Owen stopped. He and Bruno had worked for nearly an hour in the blowing snow, digging around the tires with a camp shovel, laying down old floor mats for traction, and walking Margaret safely into the station lobby where the heater still hummed like a tired heart. She had been 94, small but sharp-eyed, wrapped in a navy wool coat, with white hair pinned under a knitted hat and a voice that carried more gratitude than weakness. Before they parted, she had pressed both gloved hands around Owen's and said, "God remembers the hands that help when nobody is watching." Owen had not known what to say then. He did not know what to say now. Martin Hale removed a sealed envelope from the folder, and told him gently that Margaret had passed away in her sleep 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. There had been no children living nearby, no close family willing to manage the little property she still owned in the woods above Frostmere Lake. But in her will, she had named Owen Callahan and his dog. Owen looked down at Bruno. The German shepherd was fully awake now, ears high, eyes fixed on the envelope as if paper could carry a scent from the dead. "That has to be a mistake," Owen said. Martin shook his head. "She was very specific." He unfolded a copy of the estate summary, and pointed to a line near the middle. Margaret had left Owen a log cabin on 6 wooded acres north of Frostmere, an old structure with no reliable power, a damaged roof, cracked windows, and a county appraisal of $50. $50. The amount sat there in black ink, small and almost embarrassing. Owen nearly smiled, not because it was funny, but because life had a way of handing a man a broken thing and calling it a blessing just to see whether he still had the courage to receive it. Martin seemed uncomfortable as he explained that people in Millhaven had already made jokes about the property. Some called it a shed with a chimney. Some said it would cost more to haul away than it was worth. One man at the diner had laughed and said Margaret had left the homeless veteran a pile of firewood with a door. Owen listened without expression. He had been measured by coats, addresses, pay stubs, and sleeping places for too long to be surprised by how quickly people confused poverty with emptiness. Then Martin cleared his throat and showed him the final page of the will. Margaret's signature rested at the bottom, delicate but firm. Beneath it, written by hand in blue ink, was one last sentence. "The dog will hear what the walls have been keeping." The cold inside the truck seemed to deepen. Owen read the words once, then again. Bruno leaned forward, nose nearly touching the paper through the open window, and gave a low breath that fogged the glass. Margaret had met Bruno only once, on that snowy roadside, yet she had written about him as if she knew something even Owen did not. Martin watched the dog carefully. "Does he have special training?" Owen looked at Bruno's black harness, at the worn stitching, at the quiet intelligence in those amber eyes. "Search and rescue," he said. "Storm recovery. Collapsed structures. Missing people. He hears things most of us ignore." Martin nodded, but his face had gone pale in the winter light. He handed Owen the keys, a map, and a small brass tag stamped with the words Ellison Cabin, Frostmere Road. Owen held them in his palm, feeling their weight settle into a place no money had touched in years. By noon, the pickup was climbing north through pine country, heater coughing warm air, tires crunching over packed snow. Frostmere Lake appeared after 18 miles of narrow road, dark and glassy beneath a thin skin of ice, with wind brushing loose powder across its surface like smoke. The cabin waited beyond a bend, half hidden among spruce and birch, its log walls weathered gray, its porch sagging, its roof bowed under old snow. It looked tired, lonely, and strangely alert. Owen cut the engine. For a moment, neither he nor Bruno moved. Then the German shepherd stood slowly in the passenger seat, ears raised high, eyes fixed not on the door, but on the east wall where a small brass bell hung beneath the eave. No wind touched it. No hand moved it. Still, as Owen stepped into the snow, the bell gave one soft note, clear and fragile in the cold air, as if the cabin had recognized the dog before it recognized the man. The bell's single note faded into the snow-covered silence, but Bruno did not relax. He stood in the passenger seat of the old pickup with his ears lifted high, his amber eyes locked on the cabin's east wall, his silver-gray and cream coat catching the pale reflection of Frostmere Lake behind him. Owen Callahan remained beside the open truck door, one boot planted in the snow, one hand still holding the brass tag and keys Martin Hale had given him. The cold moved across the clearing in thin, clean sheets, carrying the scent of pine resin, frozen water, and old cedar logs. The cabin looked smaller now that he was standing before it, not grand enough for a miracle, not sturdy enough for a promise, just 4 tired walls beneath a bowed roof, waiting at the edge of the woods like a forgotten thought. Yet that bell had rung. Owen had heard it. Bruno had heard it before him. And there was no wind strong enough to move it. He crossed the yard slowly, snow creaking under his boots, while Bruno jumped down from the truck and landed beside him with the soundless balance of a working dog. The German shepherd did not pull ahead. He walked at Owen's left knee, alert and disciplined, his black harness dark against the winter brightness. Owen noticed the porch first. It had sagged nearly 3 inches on the lake side, and one step had split down the center. He tested each board before trusting his weight, the old habits returning without effort. In the service, he had learned to read weak structures by sound and pressure, by the way wood answered a boot, by the way a wall held its breath. This cabin was tired, but not finished. Not yet. The front door was faded red beneath layers of peeling paint, and when Owen slid the key into the lock, the metal turned with surprising ease. The door opened inward with a soft scrape, releasing a smell that stopped him more surely than any warning could have. Lavender. Wood smoke. Dust. Old paper. And beneath all of it, the faint sweetness of something carefully kept. He stepped inside. Bruno followed, then paused just over the threshold, nose lifted, ears moving in tiny corrections as he listened to the room. The cabin's main space was dim, lit by winter light squeezing through cracked windows. A stone fireplace sat against the north wall, its hearth swept clean, though the rest of the room wore years of abandonment. A small kitchen leaned into the left corner, with a cast-iron kettle on the stove and blue enamel cups hanging from brass hooks. A quilt, faded but neatly folded, rested over the back of a rocking chair. On the table stood a glass jar filled with dried lavender, a white lace cloth yellowed at the edges, and a framed photograph of Margaret Ellison as a young woman beside a tall man in suspenders, both standing in front of the same cabin when its logs were still honey-colored and strong. Owen removed his gloves and picked up the photograph. Margaret's smile was unmistakable, steady and knowing, as if age had only folded her face around the light that had always been there. The man beside her must have been Thomas. His hand rested on the porch rail, proud but gentle. Behind them, near the east wall, Owen noticed the same brass bell hanging inside the open doorway, bright in the photograph, polished by hands that must have touched it often. Bruno made a low sound. Owen turned. The dog was not looking at the photograph. He stood in the middle of the room facing the east wall, his body straight, tail still, one front paw slightly lifted. The wall itself looked ordinary at first, stacked logs, chinking worn pale between them, a small wooden cross hanging above a narrow shelf, and below it, a second photograph of Margaret much older, seated with a Bible in her lap and Frostmere Lake behind her. But the corner beneath the cross was strangely clean. No cobwebs. No mouse droppings. No thick dust. It was as if someone had kept that one part of the cabin waiting. Owen walked to Bruno's side. "What do you hear?" he whispered. The dog tilted his head. For several seconds, there was nothing but the soft tick of cooling wood and the muffled hush of snow sliding from a branch outside. Then Owen heard it too. Not the bell. Not exactly. A faint, hollow tapping from somewhere behind the logs, delicate and spaced apart, like metal touching wood far inside the wall. Bruno placed his lifted paw against the lowest log. The tapping stopped. Owen felt the skin along his arms tighten under his jacket. He pressed his palm to the wall. The log was cold, but beneath it, impossibly, came the lightest tremor. Not danger. Not movement from the outside. Something within. He stepped back and looked around the room for tools. Near the stove, behind a dented coal bucket, he found an old pry bar, a screwdriver, and a folded note tucked under a smooth stone. The note was written in Margaret's careful hand. "Some doors are not built to keep people out. Some are built to keep memories safe until kindness finds them." Owen read it twice. Bruno sat beside him, watchful and patient. Outside, the lake wind dragged powder against the windows, but the cabin seemed to grow warmer around them, as if a small ember had stirred inside its walls. Owen set the note on the table and brought the pry bar to the east wall. He did not tear or force anything. He worked slowly, respectfully, removing the narrow trim near the floor, then loosening one weathered strip of wood that had been disguised as part of the chinking line. The piece came free with a soft sigh. Behind it was darkness. Bruno leaned forward, sniffed once, then backed away and sat down, as if his part was to lead, not take. Owen reached into the hidden space and felt a small metal box. It was cool, square, and wrapped in cloth. He carried it to the table and unfolded the covering. The box was made of old tin, painted blue once, though most of the color had worn away. On the lid, written in white paint that had cracked with age, were 7 words: "For the man who still opened doors for strangers." Owen stared at the sentence while the room blurred at the edges. He thought of the night on Route 11, Margaret's gloved hands around his, Bruno's shaking snow from his coat, the bus station heater humming in the dark. He had not thought of it as kindness then. He had thought of it as something any decent person should do. Maybe that was why it mattered. Inside the tin box lay a brass key, a tiny music box shaped like a church, and an envelope sealed with lavender-colored wax. Before Owen could touch the envelope, the music box gave one soft note by itself. Bruno's ears rose sharply. Across the room, the old brass bell on the east wall answered with a single, trembling ring. The bell's reply hung in the air like a breath that had been waiting years to be released. Owen did not move. The little music box rested open in his palm, its tiny church steeple tilted slightly to one side, its metal teeth trembling with the last note it had played without his touch. Across the room, the brass bell on the east wall swayed once, then became still. Bruno stood between them, his silver-gray and cream coat glowing softly in the fireless dimness, ears high, eyes fixed not on the bell, but on the stone fireplace, as if another sound had answered from deeper within the cabin. Owen set the music box carefully on the table beside the brass key and the sealed envelope. His fingers felt clumsy in the cold. He had slept in truck stops, under church awnings, and in fields where frost silvered the grass before dawn, yet this quiet cabin unnerved him more than any lonely roadside ever had. Not because it felt haunted. It did not. It felt remembered. That was different. He broke the lavender-colored wax seal and unfolded Margaret's letter. Her handwriting was delicate, but every word held its shape with the steadiness of a woman who had chosen them carefully. Dear Mr. Callahan, she had written, though if you are reading this, I hope by now you understand that kindness makes strangers less strange than blood sometimes does. Owen swallowed and continued. Margaret wrote that Frostmere cabin had once been more than a summer place by the lake. In the winter of 1951, when a storm buried northern Maine under nearly 4 feet of snow and cut off the road to Millhaven, the cabin became a shelter for children who had been separated from families traveling through the region. Some were from farms. Some were from a church school. Some were passing through with relatives. The storm had scattered people, closed roads, and confused records in a time before phones could reach every hollow and hill. Margaret and her husband, Thomas Ellison, had opened the cabin to anyone brought to their door. They kept the fire alive for 9 days. They wrote down names, birthdays, towns, scraps of memory, little things children said in their sleep, anything that might help return them to the people who loved them. Owen looked toward the faded photograph of young Margaret and Thomas. Suddenly the cabin seemed warmer, crowded in memory with small booths near the hearth, blankets drying on chairs, soup steaming in dented bowls, and tired voices whispering prayers into the rafters. Margaret's letter continued. Most of the children found their way home, but not all records traveled cleanly through that winter. Some children were placed with families who cared for them deeply, but the truth of where they came from was folded into files, then misplaced, then nearly forgotten. Thomas could not bear the thought that a child's name might vanish simply because grown people failed to keep better paper. So he built a cellar behind the fireplace, dry and safe, and stored everything they had: notes, letters, photographs, adoption ledgers, church lists, winter maps, and the names of people who had helped. Owen read more slowly. Margaret wrote that after Thomas died, a dispute over the land made her cautious. A developer wanted the lakeside acreage, and later there were rumors that old documents in the cabin could complicate ownership claims around Frostmere Road. She began hiding pieces of the truth inside walls, not to make a mystery, but to protect memory until someone honest came without asking what it was worth. The last lines made Owen's chest ache. You opened my car door in a storm when no one else stopped. Your dog listened to me as if I still mattered. That is why I trust you both with the names. The bell knows where the first door is. The dog will know where the second one waits. Bruno gave a soft breath. Owen lowered the letter and followed the dog's stare to the fireplace. The hearth was made of fieldstone, broad and so dark, with a wide iron grate and a faded braided rug laid carefully in front of it. The cabin had gathered shadows as afternoon slid toward evening, and the lake outside the cracked windows had turned the blue-gray of cold steel. Owen picked up the brass key and crossed the room. Bruno walked beside him, not ahead this time, as if the next step required both of them. Near the hearth, the German shepherd lowered his nose to the rug, sniffed once, and placed his right paw gently on the edge. Owen moved the rug aside. Beneath it, the stone floor looked ordinary except for one rectangular slab near the left side of the fireplace. Its edges were too straight. Its surface was cleaner than the stones around it. Owen knelt and brushed his hand across the seam. Fine ash lifted into the light. There was a small brass circle hidden in a shallow groove near the back, no larger than a quarter. He pressed it. Nothing happened. Bruno tilted his head, then stepped closer, and nudged the lower corner of the fireplace with his nose. Owen followed the motion and saw a second mark tucked behind the ironwood box, nearly invisible under soot. He moved the box aside and found a keyhole set into the stone itself. The brass key slid in with a soft certainty that made him stop breathing for a second. When he turned it, a mechanism clicked somewhere beneath the floor, not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough that the whole hearth seemed to remember its purpose. The rectangular slab shifted half an inch, Cold air rose from the seam, carrying the scent of paper, pine boards, old metal, and something faintly sweet, like cedar shavings kept dry for many winters. Bruno backed away and sat, eyes bright, body still. Owen hooked his fingers under the brass circle and pulled. The slab lifted slowly, heavier than it looked, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness behind the fireplace. The steps were wood, not stone, worn smooth in the center, and along the first beam someone had carved a sentence by hand. No child is lost while someone remembers their name. Owen sat back on his heels. The words struck him with a tenderness so sharp it almost felt like pain, not from harm, but from the sudden nearness of all those forgotten lives. He thought of every shelter sign and sheet he had written his own name on, every form where he had become a number, every night he had wondered whether a man could disappear while still breathing. Bruno moved close and leaned against his shoulder. Owen rested one hand on the dog's harness and looked down into the cellar. Somewhere below, a faint draft stirred, and from the table behind them, the music box gave another single note, soft as a child humming from another room. Owen waited at the top of the hidden stairway until the last note from the music box faded into the timbers. The cabin had become so quiet that he could hear the soft movement of Bruno's breath beside him and the far whisper of wind brushing snow against the window panes. He had entered old buildings before, places weakened by water and time, places where caution mattered more than curiosity, so he did not rush. He took the flashlight from his pack, tested the beam against the first few steps, and pressed one boot gently onto the wood. It held. The second step held too. Only then did he nod to Bruno. The German shepherd went first, slow and careful, his black working dog harness brushing the narrow wall, his ears lifting and turning as if he were reading the darkness by sound. Owen followed with one hand on the rough beam and the other holding the flashlight low. The air changed after the fifth step. It grew cooler, drier, carrying the smell of cedar planks, old envelopes, wool blankets, and metal boxes that had not been opened in many years. Behind them, the cabin light faded to a pale rectangle above the stairwell. Ahead, the cellar widened into a room that felt less like a basement, and more like a small chapel built for memory. Owen stopped at the bottom. The beam of his flashlight moved across stone walls, shelves, trunks, and rows of wooden crates labeled in careful black handwriting. There were dates on the labels. January 1951. February 1951. Millhaven Road. Frostmere School. County Church List. Each word seemed ordinary until he understood what they were holding back. Bruno walked to the center of the room and stood beside a long table covered with folded cloth. His posture had changed again, not tense, not alarmed, but solemn. Owen stepped closer and lifted the cloth. Beneath it were stacks of letters tied with blue ribbon, small black and white photographs, school notebooks, winter ration cards, and children's mittens arranged in pairs, each with a paper tag. He touched nothing at first. He only looked. In one photograph, a little girl with dark curls sat on the cabin steps holding a tin cup in both hands. In another, 3 boys in oversized coats stood beside Thomas Ellison, snow piled nearly to the porch rail behind them. A third photo showed Margaret, younger and bright-eyed, kneeling beside a child wrapped in a quilt while the brass bell hung above them in the open doorway. Owen felt a pressure behind his eyes and turned away for a moment. He had expected perhaps old deeds, hidden money, something a lonely widow might have tucked away for a stranger who helped her once. He had not expected lives. Names. Proof that people had been saved, held, remembered. Bruno nudged a crate under the table. Owen knelt and read its label, Ellison Winter Ledger. The crate was heavier than it looked. He lifted it onto the table and opened the lid. Inside lay a leather-bound book wrapped in wax paper, a bundle of letters, and a tin box filled with small brass nameplates. The ledger's cover was worn smooth at the corners. When Owen opened it, the pages gave off the dry, sweet scent of paper that had survived by being loved. Thomas Ellison had written the first entries in firm pencil. Child found near mile marker 12. Red scarf. Says her name is Annie, possibly Annabelle. Remembers a white barn, 2 brothers, and a mother who sings hymns while baking. Owen turned another page. Boy about 7. Calls himself Joseph. Carries a wooden horse. Says his father works near the rail yard. Afraid of sleeping unless someone leaves a lamp burning. Page after page held fragments of identity, not cold records, but careful acts of attention. What a child ate. Which song calmed them? Which town name made them look up? Which blanket they refused to release? Margaret had added notes in softer handwriting years later, tracing where some had gone, who had been found, who had ridden back, and which names remained uncertain. The final section made Owen's hand still. Unmatched. Beneath that word were photographs and entries with question marks beside the names. Some had likely lived full lives under names given later by adoptive families, never knowing where their earliest memories had gone. Bruno suddenly turned toward the back of the cellar, where a narrow cabinet stood against the stone wall. He gave one soft bark. Owen carried the flashlight over. The cabinet door had a brass latch shaped like a small bell. Inside were envelopes arranged by town: Millhaven, Ashford, Cedar Lake, North Conway, Bangor, and smaller places Owen had never heard of. On the lowest shelf sat a box marked, "For the families who come looking after I am gone." Owen opened it and found a letter from Margaret addressed to whoever found the cellar. She wrote that she had tried for decades to reconnect names, but age had slowed her hands and closed too many offices before answers came. She feared the cabin would be dismissed as worthless, torn down, or sold to someone who would never understand why old paper mattered. Then came the night on Route 11, the snow, the stranded car, the quiet veteran, and the dog who watched her as if her story were still worth hearing. "I knew then," she wrote, "that some people do not need to be rich to become guardians. They only need to have suffered enough to understand the value of being remembered." Owen lowered the letter. The cellar seemed to breathe around him, not with fear, but with trust. Above them, the bell rang once, faint through the floorboards. Bruno lifted his head, then walked to a final trunk near the far wall. It was smaller than the others, made of cedar, with Margaret's initials burned into the lid. Owen opened it carefully. Inside were tiny blankets, a silver baby rattle, a faded church directory, and one photograph larger than the rest. It showed nearly 30 children gathered in front of the cabin after the storm, wrapped in quilts, cups in hand, faces tired but safe. Margaret and Thomas stood behind them. At the bottom, in Margaret's handwriting, was a sentence that made Owen sit down on the cellar floor and simply breathe. "Not every treasure shines. Some wait in paper, dust, and mercy." Owen remained seated on the cellar floor with the large photograph resting across his knees, while Bruno stood beside the cedar trunk as if guarding the quiet faces inside it. The flashlight beam softened against the stone wall, turning the room into a circle of gold surrounded by shadow. Above them, Frostmere cabin creaked gently in the winter wind, but down here, beneath the hearth, the air was still and dry, held together by cedar, paper, and the patient mercy of people who had refused to let children become forgotten names. Owen studied the photograph again. Nearly 30 children stood on the snowy porch, wrapped in quilts and borrowed coats, some smiling, some dazed, some looking past the camera as if searching for a road they could no longer see. Margaret and Thomas Ellison stood behind them, not posing like heroes, but watching over them like two tired lights that had chosen to stay burning. Owen touched the bottom edge of the photograph where Margaret had written the sentence about treasure waiting in paper, dust, and mercy. For years, he had believed treasure was something other people found, people with clean addresses, good timing, and families who knew where to send Christmas cards. Yet here he was, a man who had slept behind a church with his dog, holding something no bank could appraise properly. Bruno gave a soft huff and nudged the leather ledger with his nose. Owen understood. The story was not finished by being found. It had to be carried upward. He gathered the ledger, Margaret's letter, several labeled envelopes, and the large photograph, placing them carefully into a clean canvas tool bag from his truck. He left most of the cellar untouched, because something in him knew this room deserved witnesses before it became disturbed. When they climbed back through the hidden stairway, dusk had settled against the windows. The cabin looked different in the blue evening light. The cracked glass still needed replacing. The roof still bowed. The porch still sagged. But after seeing what lay beneath it, Owen could no longer see the place as worthless. It was a tired guardian, standing through weather and jokes and neglect, protecting names while the world forgot to ask for them. He closed the stone panel gently, and pulled the braided rug back over it, not to hide the cellar forever, but to let it rest until morning. The brass bell near the east wall was still. The small music box sat open on the table, its tiny church steeple shining faintly. Owen placed Margaret's letter beside it and lit a fire in the hearth. The first flames came slow, then steady, filling the cabin with warmth and the scent of dry pine. Bruno lay near the fireplace, head lifted, eyes still alert, though his body had begun to relax. Owen opened a can of soup from his pack and warmed it in a dented pot he found near the stove. It was not much of a supper, but the steam rising in that room felt like a ceremony. He ate slowly at the table while the photograph of the winter children rested against the lavender jar. Outside, Frostmere Lake darkened under a sky full of low clouds, and the brass bell gave no more sound. Near midnight, Owen unfolded the map Martin Hale had given him and traced the road back to Millhaven with one finger. The town was only 22 miles away, but it suddenly seemed connected to the cabin by more than a road. It was connected by names in envelopes, faces in photographs, and records that could change how people remembered their own families. Owen thought of Martin, cautious but decent. He thought of the county clerk who would know how to preserve old documents. He thought of all the people in town who had laughed about the $50 cabin without knowing their own grandparents, parents, or neighbors might have passed through its door wrapped in one of Margaret's quilts. By morning, the storm clouds had broken apart. Frost shone along the porch rail, and the lake lay quiet beneath a pale wash of sun. Owen packed the canvas bag, checked the fire twice, locked the cabin, and placed one hand against the east wall before leaving. "We will come back," he said softly, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to Margaret, Thomas, the children, or the cabin itself. Bruno waited at the truck, ears high, black harness dusted with frost. The drive into Millhaven took nearly an hour because the road was narrow, and the old pickup did not enjoy the cold. The town sat in a valley of white roofs and smoking chimneys, with a diner, a feed store, a small courthouse annex, and a library built from red brick. Owen parked outside Martin Hale's office on Main Street. People looked over as he stepped out with Bruno and the canvas bag, but he kept his eyes forward. He had learned long ago that the first step into a warm building could be harder than a mile in bad weather if you were not sure you were welcome. Martin looked up from his desk when Owen entered. His polite expression changed the moment he saw the photograph. Within minutes, the office grew silent except for the ticking of a wall clock. Martin put on reading glasses and turned the ledger pages with both hands, as if touching something fragile enough to deserve reverence. He read names, dates, places, and notes written in Margaret's and Thomas's careful hands. Once he stopped and whispered, "My grandmother used to say she spent a winter near Frostmere when she was very small. We thought it was just a family story." Owen said nothing. Bruno sat at his side, steady as a promise. Martin called the town archivist, then the county records office, then an elderly librarian named Ruth Abernathy, who arrived still wearing her winter boots and a blue cardigan buttoned unevenly in her hurry. Ruth was 78, sharp-eyed, and quiet until she saw the ledger. Then she pressed her hand to her mouth. She recognized the name Annabel from the first page. Not as a stranger. As her mother's older sister, a woman the family had searched for across decades of half-stories and uncertain documents. The room changed after that. It was no longer a legal matter alone. It became a bell rung softly through time. By noon, Martin had confirmed that Margaret's will included more than the cabin. There was a sealed trust, unopened because no one had taken the $50 property seriously enough to review the attached instructions. The trust held funds for restoration, preservation, and public access to the records if a suitable guardian accepted responsibility. Owen looked down at Bruno, then back at the photograph on the desk. He thought he had inherited a broken cabin. Instead, he had been handed a house full of lost names, a town full of unfinished prayers, and one quiet chance to prove that a man without a home could still become a keeper of memory. Martin Hale found the sealed trust in a lower drawer of his file cabinet, tucked behind routine estate papers that no one in Millhaven had thought important enough to open. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and marked with Margaret Ellison's initials in blue ink, the same steady hand that had labeled the letters beneath the cabin floor. Owen sat across from the attorney's desk with Bruno at his feet, still feeling the cold of Frostmere in his boots and the warmth of the cellar's memory in his chest. Ruth Abernathy stood near the window, holding the leather ledger as if it were a sleeping child. Outside, Main Street moved through an ordinary afternoon. A mail truck passed. Someone shoveled the diner steps. A school bus sighed at the corner. Yet inside that small law office, ordinary time seemed to pause. Martin opened the trust documents carefully, and read in silence for several minutes. His expression changed little by little, not with surprise alone, but with the slow humility of a man realizing an old woman had planned more than anyone had given her credit for. Margaret had left the cabin, 6 wooded acres, and the full contents of the cellar to Owen Callahan, but the land came with a purpose written clearly in legal language and then again in Margaret's own words. The property was to become Ellison Hearth House, a winter refuge and memory archive, open to veterans without homes, elders without family nearby, and anyone seeking records from the Frostmere winter of 1951. Funds had been set aside for roof repair, heating, document preservation, and the construction of 2 small guest rooms behind the cabin. Owen listened with his hands folded, his thumb brushing an old scar on one knuckle without thinking. Money had rarely entered his life as anything but a thing leaving. Rent, repairs, fuel, medicine for Bruno after a bad infection years ago, coffee when the nights were too long. Now it sat in front of him as a tool, not enough to make him rich in the way people imagined, but enough to make something stand that had almost fallen. Martin looked up from the page. "There is one condition," he said. Owen almost smiled. "There usually is." The attorney read the sentence aloud. "The German shepherd known as Bruno shall be named the first guardian of the hearth, in honor of the faithful animal whose listening heart helped confirm my final decision." Ruth looked down at Bruno. The dog lifted his head, ears high, solemn and unimpressed by legal dignity. For the first time all day, Owen laughed softly. It was not a big sound, but it changed the room. Ruth smiled through tears. Martin removed his glasses and rubbed at one eye as if the winter light had gotten to him. "She trusted you," the attorney said. Owen looked at the trust, the ledger, the photograph, and the dog who had stayed beside him through every season of being unseen. "She trusted what I did before I knew there was anything to gain." Ruth nodded. "That is usually the only kind of trust that matters." By late afternoon, word had begun to move through Millhaven, not as gossip at first, but as a question whispered across counters and kitchen tables. Was it true that Margaret's old cabin held records from the great Frostmere storm? Was it true that names long missing from family histories had been written down and saved? Was it true that the homeless veteran and his dog had found them? Owen did not like the attention. He stood outside the law office while Martin made calls to the County Preservation Board, watching his breath fade into the air. Bruno sat beside him, steady against the noise of passing cars and curious glances. A woman leaving the pharmacy stopped several feet away and asked, with careful politeness, whether the ledger mentioned a boy named Joseph who carried a wooden horse. Owen turned toward her. She was in her 60s, with red cheeks from the cold and hands clasped tightly around a paper bag. Ruth came to the door behind him, ledger in her arms, and asked the woman's family name. Within minutes, they were all back inside Martin's office. Ruth turned pages slowly, following Thomas Ellison's pencil entries until she found the boy. Joseph, about 7. Wooden horse. Rail yard memory. A later note in Margaret's hand said he had been placed temporarily with a family near Bangor, then formally adopted under the name Joseph Warren Hale. The woman covered her mouth and sat down hard in the nearest chair. That was my father, she whispered. He never knew why he remembered a bell. No one spoke for a while. Bruno moved to her side and rested his head gently near her knee, not demanding anything, simply offering warmth. She touched his fur with trembling fingers. Owen saw then what Margaret had meant. The records were not old paper. They were doors. Each name opened a room in someone's heart that had been locked from the outside. Over the next 2 days, Martin arranged for the documents to be scanned under careful supervision, while Ruth began matching ledger entries to public records, church archives, and family histories. Owen stayed in town because people kept arriving. An old man brought a photograph of his mother as a little girl in an unfamiliar quilt. A schoolteacher came with a family Bible. A retired nurse asked whether Margaret had written about a child called Annie. Some found answers. Some found only fragments. But even fragments mattered. A remembered scarf. A song. A road name. A bell in a storm. Each small piece seemed to give people permission to grieve and rejoice at the same time. On the third evening, Owen drove back to Frostmere cabin with Bruno, Martin, Ruth, and 2 volunteers from the library. The sun was setting behind the lake, turning the ice lavender and gold. The cabin stood quiet among the pines, still weathered, still sagging, but no longer ignored. Ruth paused at the porch and pressed her gloved hand to the doorframe. "This place kept faith better than most people do," she said. Owen unlocked the door. Inside, the brass bell rang once, though no wind had entered. Everyone froze. Bruno walked calmly to the hearth and sat before it, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light. Owen looked around the room, the faded quilt, the jar of lavender, the east wall, the old table waiting to hold names again. He had spent years thinking a home was something built for you by a light that had gone right. But standing there with the trust papers in his coat and Margaret's mission rising around him like warmth from hidden embers, he began to understand that a home could also be something entrusted to you because life had gone wrong and still left you kind. Ruth opened the cellar stairway, and together they carried down archival boxes, cotton gloves, battery lanterns, and acid-free folders. The work would take months. The roof would need repair. The records would need care. The town would need to learn how to honor what it had almost thrown away. But as Owen watched Bruno settle beside the hearth, exactly where a guardian should be, he felt the first quiet certainty he had known in years. He was not being asked to own a cabin. He was being asked to keep a light. By the end of the first week, Ellison Hearth House had begun to wake in small, careful ways. Not quickly, not with the noise of grand renovation, but with the patient rhythm of people who understood that old things must be repaired with respect. Owen arrived every morning before sunrise, parking the pickup beside the snowbank where the pines opened toward Frostmere Lake. He still wore the same worn olive army field jacket over his faded denim shirt, still carried the quiet gray-blue eyes of a man learning how to stand in one place again, and still moved with the measured strength of someone who had spent too many years expecting the world to shift beneath his feet. Bruno jumped down after him each day, silver gray and cream coat bright against the snow, black harness snug across his chest, amber eyes alert as he inspected the porch, the hearth, the east wall, and finally the cellar door beneath the braided rug. The dog had accepted his title without vanity. He simply did what he had always done. He listened. Martin Hale came with contracts, permits, and a thermos of black coffee. Ruth Abernathy brought archival sleeves, cotton gloves, and a small portable scanner borrowed from the library. Volunteers from town arrived in pairs, speaking softly at first, as if they were entering a church rather than a cabin. They removed damaged boards, patched window frames, cleared ice from the steps, and carried boxes down to the cellar under Ruth's careful direction. Owen took the roof first. He worked slowly along the lower slope, replacing cracked shingles and sealing gaps where winter had slipped in for years. From above, he could see the lake lying still under a pale sky, the road winding through birch and spruce, and Bruno resting near the porch where sunlight touched his ears. For the first time in longer than he could name, Owen worked on something that was not temporary. Not a quick repair for a stranger. Not a roadside fix paid in cash and forgotten by morning. Every nail he set seemed to say stay. Every board he measured seemed to answer you belong here too. The ledger brought people steadily. Some came with hope. Some came with caution. Some came pretending they were only curious, though their hands shook when Ruth turned the pages. An elderly man named Peter Lawson arrived with his granddaughter and a photograph of a woman in a red scarf. Ruth found Annabelle's entry after 20 minutes of searching. The little girl with dark curls from the cellar photograph had grown into Peter's mother, though the family had never known why she kept a brass bell on her kitchen shelf, or why she cried whenever snow closed the roads. Peter stood in the cabin kitchen staring at the old bell on the east wall, and when it moved faintly in the warm draft from the repaired stove, he covered his face with both hands. Owen looked away to give him privacy, but Bruno walked over and sat beside the man until his breathing steadied. Another day, a retired school principal brought a wooden horse wrapped in tissue. It had belonged to her father, Joseph, the boy from the ledger who had refused to sleep unless someone left a lamp burning. The toy fit the description exactly: one wheel missing, one ear carved too large, initials scratched beneath the belly. Ruth placed it beside the ledger, and the room seemed to draw a softer breath. It was not proof in the way courts used the word, but it was truth in the way families understood it. Each connection made the cabin feel less like an inheritance, and more like a bridge stretching backward through storm and forward into mercy. Still, not everyone welcomed what the cabin was becoming. A man named Clayton Voss came one afternoon in a clean truck with a county development sticker on the windshield and a smile that never reached his eyes. He owned land near Frostmere Road and had once hoped Margaret's property would be sold cheaply, cleared, and folded into a lakeside rental project. He stood at the porch while Owen carried cedar boards from the truck bed and said, in the smooth voice of someone pretending to be reasonable, that old stories could make practical people sentimental. He said the cabin was unsafe, the road was poor, and Millhaven needed tax revenue more than memories. Owen set the boards down carefully. He did not raise his voice. He only looked past Clayton to the open cabin door, where Ruth was helping an old woman read a name she had waited 70 years to find. Bruno stepped onto the porch then, not growling, not threatening, simply standing between the man and the doorway with his ears high and his body still. Clayton glanced at the dog, then at Owen's weathered face, the silver at his temples, the light stubble on his jaw, the old army jacket, the work-worn hands. "You really think you can run a place like this?" he asked. Owen rested one hand on Bruno's harness. "No," he said quietly. "I think we can." The word we settled over the porch like a beam set true. Martin later explained that the trust was firm, the land protected, and the restoration legally funded. Clayton left with polite frustration, tires crunching over snow as he drove away. Owen watched him go without triumph. He had learned that some people could only see land as profit, wood as lumber, old paper as clutter, and lonely people as burdens. But the cabin had survived that kind of blindness before. It would survive it again. That evening, after the volunteers left and Ruth locked the archival boxes, Owen remained by the hearth with Bruno stretched at his feet. The firelight moved across the repaired stones and warmed the brass bell until it glowed softly. On the table lay the large photograph of the winter children, now protected in a clear sleeve. Owen studied their faces, then looked around the room that had once seemed too broken to save. The roof no longer leaked. The east wall held steady. The cellar was catalogued. The first guest room frame had been marked in chalk behind the cabin. A $50 appraisal had missed all of this because appraisals measured boards, acreage, and resale. They did not measure names returned to families, old grief given language, or a dog who heard what walls had been keeping. Bruno lifted his head suddenly. The bell gave one clear note, though no one had touched it. Owen smiled, tired and grateful, and added another log to the fire. Perhaps memory, when warmed by kindness, knows how to ring for itself. The next morning brought a thaw. It came gently at first, with beads of water gathering along the porch rail and sliding from the pine branches in bright drops that caught the early sun. Frostmere Lake, still half covered with ice, shimmered under a veil of mist, and the road into Millhaven softened from hard white to gray slush. Owen Callahan arrived before the others, as he had begun to do every day, the old pickup rolling into the clearing with a familiar rattle, Bruno upright in the passenger seat like a sentry returning to his post. The cabin looked almost alive now. New cedar shingles patched the worst of the roof. The front step had been braced. A sheet of clear plastic protected the window that would soon be replaced. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, hopeful line. Owen stepped out into the wet morning wearing his worn olive army field jacket over the faded denim shirt, his weathered white face turned toward the building with the quiet gray-blue eyes of a man who still did not fully trust blessings, but had stopped pushing them away. His short dark brown hair, touched with slight silver at the temples, lifted in the lake breeze, and the light stubble along his jaw caught the pale gold of sunrise. Bruno jumped down beside him, his silver-gray and cream coat damp at the paws, his black working dog harnessed snug across his strong chest, his amber eyes already fixed on the east wall. For a moment, the dog stood perfectly still. Then he gave one soft bark. Owen followed his gaze to the brass bell. It did not ring this time. It only shone. By noon, the cabin was full of careful movement. Ruth Abernathy worked in the cellar with 2 library volunteers, placing each document into protective sleeves and recording names into a laptop set on a folding table. Martin Hale stood near the kitchen, reading aloud from Margaret's Trust while Owen listened with a carpenter's pencil tucked behind one ear. The document described more than restoration. It named the cabin, the land, and the small fund Margaret had saved over decades from quiet investments, careful living, and the sale of property no one knew she still owned outside town. There was enough to repair the cabin properly, build 2 guest rooms, preserve the Frostmere records, and maintain the place through winter. But the final portion changed the room. Martin paused before reading it, then looked at Owen over his glasses. Margaret had written that if the Guardian accepted the trust, Ellison Hearth House would not be a museum alone. It would be a refuge. A warm room. A listening table. A place where veterans without stable housing, elderly neighbors alone in winter, and families searching for lost roots could come without being treated like burdens. Owen looked toward the hearth, where Bruno lay with his head on his paws beneath the bell. The dog's ears lifted at the word Guardian. Ruth climbed halfway up from the cellar, hearing enough to smile. Martin continued. The first guardian of the hearth shall be Bruno, whose faithful listening heart helped me choose the man who would not mistake brokenness for worthlessness. Owen lowered his head, not from embarrassment, but because the words had found a place inside him that had gone unprotected for a long time. He had been called many things since leaving the service. Unreliable. Drifter. Hard case. Unemployed. Homeless. He had learned to let those words pass over him like bad weather. But Guardian landed differently. It did not describe what he lacked. It described what he could protect. In the afternoon, the first real gathering happened without anyone planning it. People came with boxes, envelopes, photographs, and food wrapped in towels to keep warm. Peter Lawson brought a pot of stew and the story of his mother's red scarf. The woman from the pharmacy brought a framed picture of her father Joseph beside the wooden horse. A young couple came from Ashford after hearing that the ledger mentioned their great-grandmother's maiden name. An elderly veteran named Miles Donnelly arrived slowly in a county van, wearing a brown cap and holding a paper bag with everything he owned for the week. Martin had arranged for him to stay in the finished back room above the old storage space, just for a few nights at first, until the new guest rooms were ready. Miles stood at the threshold and looked uncertain, as if kindness were a door that might close if he stepped through too quickly. Owen recognized that look. He had worn it himself behind St. Bartholomew's Church. Bruno rose from the hearth, crossed the room, and sat beside Miles without making a sound. The old man looked down at the German shepherd, then at Owen. "Is he friendly?" he asked. Owen smiled faintly. "He is particular." Miles gave a quiet laugh, the kind that had not been used in a while, and stepped inside. As evening settled, the cabin filled with the smell of stew, pine smoke, old books, and coffee. Ruth read selected names from the ledger, never too quickly, giving each one room to breathe. Some people cried. Some smiled at details no official record would have kept, like a child who refused carrots, a boy who sang to himself during snow, a girl who remembered her mother's blue apron. Owen listened from near the door, one hand resting lightly on Bruno's back. Outside, the lake darkened to violet, and the repaired roof held steady as a thin rain began to fall. Clayton Voss passed once on the road but did not stop. His truck lights moved between the trees and disappeared. The cabin did not seem to notice. It had more important work now. Near the end of the night, Ruth opened Margaret's final letter, the one sealed inside the trust. Her voice trembled only once as she read Margaret's wish that every winter, on the first Sunday after the lake froze, the bells should be rung for the children who found shelter here, for the families who never stopped wondering, and for every person who came through the door believing they had been forgotten. When Ruth finished, the room remained silent. Then Miles, the old veteran in the brown cap, stood slowly and walked to the east wall. He looked back at Owen as if asking permission. Owen nodded. Miles reached up and touched the rope. The brass bell rang once, clear and warm, and this time there was no mystery in it. Only memory. Only welcome. Bruno lifted his head and gave a soft breath. Owen looked around the room at the faces lit by fire and lamplight, at the table covered in photographs, at the repaired walls, at the people sitting close enough to share warmth. The cabin had been valued at $50 because no one had counted what mattered. They had counted the cracked windows, the bent roof, the damaged porch. They had not counted the names. They had not counted the mercy. They had not counted the sound of a bell making lonely people feel expected. Owen stepped outside for a moment and stood beneath the eave, watching rain silver the snow around his boots. Behind him, voices rose softly inside the cabin, not loud, not polished, but alive. Bruno came to stand beside him, shoulder against his knee. Owen rested his hand on the dog's head and looked toward Frostmere Lake, where the mist was lifting just enough to reveal a narrow path of moonlight across the ice. He understood then that Margaret had not left him a reward. She had left him a responsibility shaped like grace. By the time the first full spring warmed Frostmere Lake, Ellison Hearth House no longer looked like a forgotten cabin waiting for winter to finish it. The roof had been rebuilt with dark cedar shingles, the windows had been replaced with clear glass, the porch stood straight on new posts, and the brass bell on the east wall shone in the morning light like a small sun that had learned how to sing. Wildflowers rose along the path where snowbanks had once pressed against the truck tires, and the lake, free of ice at last, carried the sky in long blue ribbons toward the far pines. Owen Callahan still woke early, but not in the cramped cab of his pickup behind a church. He woke in the small room beside the hearth, where the walls smelled of fresh pine and old lavender, where a folded quilt waited at the foot of the bed, and where Bruno slept across the threshold as if guarding not only the man, but the peace that had finally found him. Owen was still 40 years old, still a white man with a weathered face, quiet gray-blue eyes, short dark brown hair touched with slight silver at the temples, light stubble along his square jaw, a worn olive army field jacket, a faded denim shirt, and broad shoulders shaped by years of service and survival. Yet something in his posture had changed. He no longer moved like a man preparing to leave before anyone asked him to go. He moved like someone responsible for a flame. Bruno changed too, though more quietly. The German shepherd was still 6 years old, silver gray and cream in the coat, sharp amber in the eyes, tall in the ears, steady in the heart, wearing his simple black working dog harness whenever visitors came. But now his patrols ended at the hearth, where people smiled when he entered the room and children from town whispered his name with the kind of respect usually given to old legends. On the first Sunday after the lake thawed, the people of Millhaven gathered at the cabin for the dedication Margaret had requested. There were folding chairs in the meadow, coffee on the porch, pies cooling beneath clean towels, and a long table covered with copies of photographs from the Frostmere winter of 1951. Ruth Abernathy had spent months matching names from the ledger to families, churches, census pages, school records, and the memories people carried in fragments. Some mysteries remained unfinished, but many had opened like windows. Annabel's descendants stood near the lilacs with a framed portrait of the girl in the red scarf. Joseph's family placed a little wooden horse in a glass case beside the ledger. Miles Donnelly, the elderly veteran who had first stayed in the back room, now helped serve coffee to newcomers with a steadiness that made Owen quietly proud. Martin Hale read the final language of the trust beneath the repaired porch roof, his voice carrying across the grass. Ellison Hearth House was now officially a refuge, a memory archive, and a winter shelter supported by Margaret's fund, local donations, and a conservation agreement protecting the 6 wooded acres around the cabin. When Martin spoke Bruno's title, first guardian of the hearth, the crowd turned toward the German shepherd sitting beside Owen. Bruno blinked once, dignified and calm, while laughter and applause moved gently through the meadow. Owen looked down at him, and felt the strange tenderness of being seen without having to explain why he had once disappeared. Then Ruth stepped forward with Margaret's final photograph, the large one from the cedar trunk showing nearly 30 children wrapped in quilts on the snowy porch. Her voice was soft but clear as she read the sentence written beneath it. Not every treasure shines. Some wait in paper, dust, and mercy. The crowd grew still. Wind moved through the birch leaves. Somewhere near the lake, a bird called once and fell silent. Owen was asked to speak, but for a moment all he could do was look at the cabin. He remembered the first day, the bell ringing without wind, the hidden box in the east wall, the stairway behind the hearth, the ledger in the cellar, the faces that had waited so long to be remembered. He remembered Margaret's car in the snow, her gloved hands around his, and the words she had spoken before he ever knew she had a cabin or a plan or a trust. God remembers the hands that help when nobody is watching. Owen stood with one hand resting on Bruno's harness. I thought I was being given a broken building, he said, his voice rough but steady. Then I thought I was being given old records. But I was wrong both times. I was being asked to keep a door open. Margaret and Thomas did that in a storm. Ruth kept the names safe in town memory. Martin helped make the promise stand. And Bruno heard what the walls had been keeping before any of us understood how to listen. He paused, looking at the people gathered there, families, elders, veterans, children, neighbors who had once laughed at the cabin and now brought flowers to its steps. A place is not worthless because it is weathered. A person is not worthless because they have slept outside. A memory is not gone because it was misplaced. Sometimes all three are waiting for someone to come back with enough kindness to open the door. No one clapped immediately. The silence was too full. Then Miles rose first, brown cap in his hands, and the applause followed like rain beginning softly on a roof. At sunset, after the chairs were folded and the last cars had gone down Frostmere Road, Owen remained on the porch with Bruno beside him. The cabin glowed behind them, warm with lamplight, voices, and the smell of coffee still lingering in the boards. Ruth had left the ledger secured in its case. Martin had locked the trust documents in the office drawer. Miles was washing cups in the kitchen, humming under his breath. Owen looked across the lake, where the last light stretched gold over the water. The pickup still sat near the trees, dented and faithful, but it no longer looked like home. It looked like the road that had brought him there. Bruno leaned his head against Owen's knee. The brass bell moved slightly in the evening air and gave one clear note, gentle as a blessing. Owen smiled and rested his hand on the dog's silver-gray fur. He had not found gold inside the cabin. He had found something far harder to lose once it was given back: names, purpose, shelter, and the quiet proof that kindness can travel through years, through storms, through walls, and still arrive exactly when a wounded heart is ready to hear it.